When the Sydney tram network closed down in 1961, many of the tram cars were in very good condition. Some were only 8 years old for Pete's sake. While many were scrapped via burning at Randwick workshops, several were sold off to be converted into things such as farmhouses. Several were given to museums, and notably, some of the maintenance cars were sold to different cities with their tram networks. One of these cars would be in and out of service again and again, having modifications all throughout its life. This is 134S. In 1896, New South Wales Government Tramways would order one single bogie Californian combination tram with open crossbenches at the ends and a saloon in the centre. They ordered this kind of tram from Clyde Engineering, who would deliver this tram under the number of 123. This would become the D-Class tram, the longest electric tram on the network at the time. After many experiments along the line between Waverley and Randwick, it was decided to make permanent electrified tram lines on the most harsh lines on the network. Steep hills, tight bends, pretty much anywhere that the previous A-Class steam motors and B-Class steam tram trailers had difficult with, to put it simply. These further electrified lines would be North Sydney to Mossman and Edgecliff to Rose Bay. These lines had been served by, until this point, exclusively the C-Class trams. In 1899, the tram line down George Street would be electrified, bringing the first fully electric tram depots into operation. This tram would be allocated to Ultimo Tram Depot, which also housed several other C-Class trams. However, this was also the year that the rest of the D-Class's trams would arrive. A new fleet of 24 trams would come to Sydney, built by Clyde Engineering and Ritchie Brothers. These would have been numbered as trams 98 to 121. Tram 122 was an F-Class for your information. These cars were different from 123 due to their roof. While 123 had an elliptical roof, these newer ones would have a clerestory roof. These cars would enter service that same year, sometimes hauling cable or steam tram trailers in peak hour times. I should mention this before I forget, the only reasons that these cars were built in the Californian style was just so that smokers would be able to huff their cancer tubes in comfort, as on the C-Classes they could only do that on the very tiny front and back, which was unhelpful as that was where, the crew was. It was a logical solution at the time. These trams would operate on the northern half and southern half of the network until the 1920s. By this time, a lot of the original tramway fleet were getting quite old and unsafe. Almost all tram cars were built with a toast rack design, a far more bare-bones version of an average compartment coach on railway networks. This would mean that when conductors would head along the tram to sell and check tickets, they would have to shuffle down these footboards applied to the tram sides. These footboards, despite the hand grips installed, were incredibly dangerous, especially given the hard stone streets and lackluster safety legislations of the time. Between 1916 and 1932, over 4,097 accidents would occur from conductors falling off the tram cars, the majority suffering from fractured skulls. To add salt to the wound, a further 10,228 passengers would fall from the tram while getting on or off. This was why almost every other tram network in Australia would use the drop centre saloon style of trams. This would only end by 1933 with the introduction of the R-Class trams. In 1925, all D-Class trams would be withdrawn, which was quite stupid as it was one of the only types of tram to have at least some form of saloon. However, this was when the conversions would begin. Earlier in 1913, Tram 117 would be converted to a breakdown tram, currently preserved at the Sydney Tram Museum. The rest of these would be converted to scrubber cars, tram wagons that could grind down rails and also sweep the rails, spraying water when needed, with 123 turning into 43S and 102 becoming 137S. Some other scrubber cars include 138S and 139S. All these conversions would be complete by 1930. However, another thing was coming up: closure of the network. The 1950s and 60s would see the demise of many tram networks worldwide, especially in more capitalist-driven countries, leading to Sydney's closure in 1961. 134S would be bought by the Sydney Tram Museum, while 43S would be scrapped. 138S and 139S were given interest from Melbourne and Brisbane, with Brisbane wanting one of them and Melbourne wanting both. Melbourne won, and Brisbane was compensated by 137S. 137S would continue in service until 1968, where it was scrapped just 1 year before the Brisbane tram network would fully close. 134S would be transferred to Loftus, where the Sydney Tram Museum is, in 1965. It would have a rather quiet life until the 1970s. The Eastern Suburbs line was Sydney's third underground railway line, heading from Erskineville to Redfern, Central, and then merging into Town Hall, where it then splits off and heads to Martin Place, King's Cross, Edgecliff, and Bondi Junction. This line had been planned since the 1870s, 100 years earlier. Eastern Suburbs every time. After construction being abandoned again and again, work would resume fully in 1976. Back then, barely any scrubber vehicles were in service in New South Wales. This meant that by 1979, makeshift equipment would have to be used. 73 classes were modified to safely operate in the tunnels, and 134S was brought back into service to act as a scrubber and grinder. It would run several times along the railway line, ironing out imperfections. It would haul around this little wagon here, which was probably the rail grinder, or a small diesel motor, since I can't find any photos of when its pantograph was up. Much of the hiring costs went to the construction of the museum's new site, which is where it's based today. The Eastern Suburbs Railway also had these Railroad Land Rovers, specifically modified to run on LP gas. Then, in 1980, as part of the Illawarra line upgrades to get ready for the ESR, the Cronulla line was duplicated between Caringbah and Gymea. It meant that 134S would be sent down to do what was the same job, which would be awesome to see. 134S on my school commute? Plus it would have headed past Miranda Fair. Anyways, after this, it would be returned to the museum for the second time, now with the second site funded even further. Sadly, no images of this were ever taken. Once again, the tram returned to Loftus and returned to a calm life. It should be known that at Loftus, the tram would be used for routine maintenance, which is kind of expected, to be honest. This was until 1997, where one of the biggest changes to Sydney's tram history would occur. CGEA Transport, better known today as Transdev, had been operating in Australia, Hillside Trains in Melbourne, South Trans buses in southern Sydney, notably where I live, and many other operations worldwide. In 1997, constructed had been completed of the Sydney Light Rail, a new line from the Central Station concourse running along the original tram alignment to George Street, turns off into Paddy's Markets, and then onto the abandoned Darling Harbour goods line as far as Wentworth Park. This is where 134S would, yet again, return to service, this time on an actual tram line. This was different, however, as now it was equipped with a proper pantograph instead of a regular trolley pole. This pantograph was taken from a German tram from Berlin, DDR, which is East Germany, TZ69, number 5133, which had been preserved at the Sydney Tram Museum. The inner workings of the tram were completely rewired for this occasion, this tram being chosen due to its low-speed capabilities. These modifications are still there, with a little Loftus Sydney selector switch. Another little thing to note, when the light rail opened, it would head around the colonnade the opposite direction as to before. This was not the case for 137S, which seen here was going in the, in quotes, correct, end quotes, direction. After these runs, it was given back to Loftus and is still used to this day, albeit now in the Loftus mode with a trolley pole. During early 2020, the GE floor compressor of 134S was renewed. This was due to extended wear and tear of it after years of gunk build-up in it. Scrubber Car 11, another Sydney scrubber made from a K-Class, story for another time, was taken into the workshop for an overhaul at the same time. The scrubbing pistons, water tanks, compressor motors, field coils, and much more were removed to be washed and repaired. After a couple months of restoration, it would return to regular service, with its latest use being cleaning the rebuilt tram track at Tramway Avenue as seen here. After 122 years, 134S is still going strong in Sydney, from its passenger life, to its maintenance life, to its abandoned life, to its heritage life, to its eastern suburbs life, to its Miranda life, to its Darling Harbour life, to its workshop life, to today. It has stood strong. It truly is the phoenix of Sydney, the tram with 9 lives. And that is something that should be honoured. Oh, and also, remember 117S, the Breakdown Tram? Guess what? It's preserved at Loftus. It's currently being transformed back into a D-class passenger tram, so that for the first time since 1925, we will be able to see a proper D-class tram. Thank you for the Sydney Tram Museum, Matthew Gear, and Trams Down Under for making this video possible.